Now we're going to move on to adaptations that plants have to survive on land. So land plants, just like animals, evolved from aquatic organisms. So just like animals, plants have also then evolved traits to survive on land. The stressors and the evolutionary selection pressures on land are very different from those that are on water. So if we look back, looking at a phylogeny or evolutionary history, the closest living relative, so thing that's still alive today, to plants is this plant in the genus Chorales, also called the stonewort. So this is the close. It's not a plant, but it's the closest living relative to a plant. What traits does it have? Well, it's a green algae. So green meaning it's photosynthetic, probably has chlorophyll, right? It's aquatic. It does not have vascular tissue, so it doesn't have those straws that run through it. It also doesn't have any true roots. What that means is it could have something that's like root-like, but it's not sucking up water and nutrients and transporting to the plant. They're probably just for holding on. They're not really doing much else. It also doesn't have any true leaves. That might have things that look like leaves, but developmentally, they're not actually leaves. So from that, the plants have evolved a variety of different traits. Alternation of generations, sporangia, gametangia, apical meristems, vascular tissue in the form of xylem and phloem, roots, cuticles, and stomata. And we're going to go through each one of those in turn. So we've already talked a little bit about alternation of generations. This is the idea that in the plants, plants have two different generations, a haploid phase and a diploid phase. The haploid phase being the gametophyte and the diploid phase being the sporophyte. Now, different plants have one phase more dominant than the other, and they kind of switch depending on which taxonomic plants you're talking about. But it's important to understand how this is going to work. And it's going to be even more odd when we get to how this works in angiosperms and gymnosperms, which have kind of made these into a more complicated system. So when we're talking about haploid, we're talking about one set of chromosomes. For example, humans are diploid. We have two sets of chromosomes. We get one set from our mom and one set from our dad. That means we have two sets, we are diploid. Chromosomes are just individual chains of DNA. And so we have 46 different strands of DNA, 23 types of chromosomes, and we have a pair of each one, which makes the 46. It makes us diploid. The gametophyte phase is haploid. You can see that here with the 1 N. That means it only has one copy of chromosomes. The sporophyte phase is diploid, 2 N, two copies of every chromosome. Now, the gametophyte stage is the one that produces gametes. So gametes being sperm and egg, right? So the gametophyte phase here produces gametes. Another individual will produce a different gamete. You can see that one floating in here. They're going to come together for fertilization. They're going to fuse, create a zygote. So the zygote is in diploid because it takes the sperm and the egg. They're going to come together and they're going to make a diploid individual. Two haploid gametes make a diploid, a zygote. It's going to grow up and produce a sporophyte. The sporophyte is going to release spores that they're going to develop through mitosis into the gametophyte. And they're going to continue this cycle over and over again. Now, I get this diagram is a little bit abstract, so let's kind of look at more life cycles of individual plants. So liverworts, here's a liverwort plant, right? They like to live in really wet environments. Now, scoot forward here, I can't really see it. Now, down here are the gametophytes, right? So these are the haploid stages of the liverwort, which is a little bit different from the other one because generally the gametophyte is the shorter term stage. It's not the dominant one, but in liverworts it is. Now the liverwort's going to produce these little heads here, Archegonia and Entheridia. Now, here's this little sperm will swim from one into the archegonium of the other to produce an egg. So here you can see the egg here. The sperm swims up into the egg. It's going to grow into the embryo, and it's going to create a sporophyte, or this is this mature sporophyte. So it's going to develop into a sporophyte, grow, release a bunch of spores. These spores are then going to go down, grow into a gametophyte over here. And this cycle continues. So gametophyte, there's male and female ones that are separate. sperm and egg get released. They rely on water, so the sperm's going to swim through water, not in a stream or anything, but in like a wet rock, on a wet rock or something by a stream. And they're going to keep reproducing in this pattern. So gametophyte stages here, sporophyte stages. Gametophyte, sporophyte, gametophyte, sporophyte, and so forth. Now we talked about the fern one before. Here's a fern. This is a fern sporophyte. Sporophytes get released. This one here, the sporophyte, is the dominant stage. So the diploid stage is dominant. So the sporophyte releases spores. They grow into the gametophyte. Gametophyte releases sperm and egg. They get fertilized, grow into the sporophyte. And they continue in this cycle. Now, it's different when we talk about angiosperms and gymnosperms, the seed plants. Over here, you can see a flower. Flower tells us it's an angiosperm, right? Now, the flower here, and the whole plant itself, is the sporophyte. The flower is going to produce pollen through the anthers, and inside the ovary is going to be an ovule. So we'll follow the male pathway here first. You don't have to know all the little details about it, but you need to understand the alternation of generations. So the anther is going to produce these little pollen grains that are the microspores. So these are the ones that are going to produce the gametes. So the microspore is going to go through mitosis, get turned into the microgametophyte here. So here's the microgametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte produces the gametes. So this little pollen is going to land on the stigma. It's going to grow a pollen tube down to the ovule here, and as a result, the nuclei inside of the microgametophyte there is going to turn into sperm, and that sperm will go into the egg that's inside of the ovule there. Now here on the opposite side, here's the ovary. Here's the ovary here. The ovary here is going to produce an ovule, which inside it's going to have the macrospore. It's going to go through meiosis to create a megagametophyte, the one that produces the gametes. And here the egg is going to be produced right inside of there. So when we get down to here, the sperm is going to swim through the pollen tube, go into the ovule, and go to that nuclei, which is the egg now, and fertilize it. So it's very different, and we're going to go into more detail of that. I don't expect you to know all of that right off the bat. But very different from these two. Two separate individuals, not fully separate individuals. The gametophyte is not nearly as long-lived and kind of different than what it is in the non-seed plants. Now they also have sporangia. These are found in the seedless land plants. So I don't think I have any sporangia on here right now. But here's a fern. You flip it over on the back. You can see these sori. These are the sporangia that are going to produce the spores. So if it's a male, it's going to produce the vascular spore, a microspore. Actually, well, let me back up. Non-vascular seed plants, so the bryophytes and stuff like that, they're homospores, meaning their spores are the same size. It doesn't matter male, female, any of that. They all look the same. They're uniform. Homospores. Vascular seedless plants, like ferns, produce two sites because they're heterospores. The microspore, the smaller one, is the male. The megaspore, the larger one, is the female. That's actually how biologists define sex. It's the one with the smaller gamete is male, and the one with the larger gamete is female. Sperm is a lot smaller than egg, therefore individuals with sperm categorized as male. One with the larger egg categorized as female. Now remember, these definitions are very different from what we talk about in society and human societies and culture and all of that. So keep in mind, we're defining things very differently here, and it has nothing to do with human society and discourse. But for what we're talking about now, small spore, male, big spore, female. Now, what's the function of these sporangia? One, to protect the spores. Until they can develop and grow and be ready to disperse, they need to be protected. But then also to allow the spores to be dispersed when they're ready. Then we also have, so instead of sporangia, we also have gametangia. These are vessels for gametes. So these are found, again, only in the seedless plants. They're found in the gametophyte. So in the gametophyte stage of the alternation of generation cycle. So they're the ones that are going to be producing the gametes. Gametangia, gamete-producing cells. The purpose, protect the gamete until it's ready to be released. Help prevent self-fertilization. A lot of organisms don't want to fertilize with themselves because then you don't get the benefits of sexual reproduction. And allows you to control fertilization. So sporangia produce the spores, protect the spores, disperse the spores. Gametangia produce the gametes, protect the gametes, prevent self-fertilization. Sporangia found in the sporophyte, gametangia found in the gametophyte. Both of those only in seedless plants. We then also have apical meristem. Now, let me back up actually. The benefit to sporangia and gametangia, by the way, for living on land is that it allows you to have a dispersal mechanism that you can control when they are being dispersed. So, recent rainfall, great time to disperse your spores and gametophytes. Most of these still have sperm in some way that are motile. They want to swim through water. Spores are going to probably need water to grow in some different way. And so that they can control that dispersal mechanism. Then we have apical meristem. This means that you're growing from the tips. So here's the tip of this little leaf from my fern. It's going to grow from the tip out. Same thing for the roots. They're going to grow. Let's see if I can show you this here. You can see all these little roots in here. These roots in here are going to grow from the tip outward, right? That's apical meristem, right? So they're growing from the apex of the shoot or the root. This allows it to grow and get longer or taller, right? So at the very tips of the roots and the shoots, it's this area of rapid cell division, which means they're undergoing mitosis really, really rapidly. So apex means, or apical just means the apex, the tip. Meristem is a type of tissue that are very much undifferentiated, so they can still specialize later on. Here, this little darker region here, that's what we call the shoot apical meristem. So that's the part that's going to be growing outwards. These are leaves, and these are leaf primordia, so newly forming leaves. So this stem is going to be growing out this direction. And the apical meristem is also down in the roots. This allows them to grow towards resources. It allows them to outcompete neighbors by growing up taller, and it allows them to be able to compete in a land-based environment really, really well. Now, there's other types of meristem, particularly lateral meristem, which allows plants to grow wider. Apical meristem allows elongation. Lateral meristem allows thickening. Now, if we're talking about the vascular plants, they also have vascular tissue. This is a huge adaptation to living on land because you don't always have water and nutrients everywhere around you. In the aquatic environment, you don't need to worry about water. Water's everywhere. Nutrients are dissolved in the water. You can absorb those from the water themselves. If you live on land, you can't do that. So the non-vascular plants are tied closer to water. They're not necessarily living in water, although some plants definitely do. But they're in areas that are really, really wet. Like a liverwort, no vascular tissue. So they live in very wet environments where they can just get water through their tissues through diffusion. Now, vascular plants have evolved to take water from one spot and move it to everywhere else in the plant. So they can transport water wherever it needs to go. So over here you can see a plant. You have roots down here. You have a shoot up here, flowers or whatever it might be. The way this will work is that there's soil or water in the soil. There's a gradient to where the water is going to be sucked into the plant. So water moves into the roots. It's going to move into what we call the xylem. Xylem is the type of vascular tissue that takes water from the roots up into the plant. So xylem's going to go, water's going to go into the xylem through the roots, up into the stem and the shoot, and then all the way to the end of the plant. Now, it's going to primarily go to a lot of times to the leaves. The leaves are going to be the site of photosynthesis usually. Photosynthesis is going to produce a lot of sugars. So then the water and the nutrients will move into the phloem. The phloem is going to take the nutrients and some water throughout the entire plant, wherever it needs to go. So xylem's carrying water up into the plant. Phloem's distributing sugars from photosynthesis throughout the plant. So usually it's kind of described as xylem up and phloem down. So this also creates turgor pressure. You ever seen a plant wilt? That's from a loss of turgor pressure. When there's not enough water moving through the roots here, you lose pressure in this water system and the plants start to droop. We'll talk about cell organelles later on. Remember we had the plant walls, right? If I can make a square here like this. Inside of there is a little circle. That circle fills up and pushes against it. That's called the central vacuole, and it's turgor pressure. As water pushes into the central vacuole, it gives the plant a lot of rigidity. If that central vacuole starts to shrink, the cell walls start to fall down, and the plant itself will wilt. So The vascular tissue allows for the maintaining of turgor pressure. If you have a plant that wilted, you lost turgor pressure, which, if it's caught quickly, might not be that big of a deal. In some plants, it's not a huge deal at all. Other plants, they're dead right away, and so it kind of varies. But it's an important attribute for keeping a plant upright. Now later on, when we talk about some of those woody plants, vascular tissue can also turn into wood, creating a really strong support against gravity. Wood in a perennial plant allows it to have this really strong physically tough structural integrity to it that resists gravity. In an aquatic environment, you don't need to resist gravity. If you want to point straight up, create some sort of a float-like structure. You'll float up, right? That's what kelp does. On land, you have to fight gravity. So you need tissues that are strong enough to go up, fighting gravity, and resist any perturbations that you might experience from wind or animals or whatnot. And wood is a good way to do that. They also have roots. Roots perform a lot of different functions. Like we just said, roots allow you to get water from underground. Water moves into the roots, into the xylem, and up, right? Roots allow you to access that water. They also allow access to water when you're not even near surface water. A lot of desert plants have no access to water. They can go really deep into the ground and get water from it. But also very importantly is that, especially trees and big plants, it's very easy to just fall over. Your roots are your foundation to resisting perturbations, right? So the roots stop this from happening. They're going to hold you really steady. So they're providing a really strong support against these land-based disturbances that they didn't have to deal with in water. So these roots are a strong foundation for a lot of plants. Now, when you're surviving on land, you also always got to worry about losing too much water. So dehydration, or what we call desiccation in a plant, can be very deadly. One, it can cause wilting, but it can also cause death. So plants have a lot of adaptations to prevent dehydration and desiccation. One of the big ones is that a lot of plants have a cuticle. So here's the cross section of a leaf. So if you at the leaf in cross section and zoom in on a microscope, which we do in the lab a lot, at the top of the leaf here is a little waxy layer, and at the bottom of the leaf is a little waxy layer. That's called a cuticle. Remember, water and fats don't mix. That waxy layer is made out of fats. It prevents water from going in and out of the leaves wherever that waxy substance is. So it's a way to prevent evaporative loss of water from the leaf. So maintaining that water balance, not losing too much water. Now, that also means, though, it blocks air. So plants need to get rid of the oxygen that they have and bring in the CO2. So that cuticle can interfere with that. So how do they deal with that? Well, they have what's called a stomata. Stomata is a little pore in the leaves or in the epidermal layers of the plant that are surrounded by guard cells. Is there one inside of here? Yeah. You see, if you zoom in right there, there's a guard cell and there's a guard cell. And here's an electron microscope image of it. Here's a guard cell here. That's stomata there and guard cells on the side. And what that basically means is that when plants want to breathe, they want to bring in CO2 or exhale oxygen, they just separate the guard cells and gas can diffuse in and out. If they don't want to do that, say if it's really hot and they're worried about losing too much water through that stomata, they close it up. And then they're no longer getting oxygen out and CO2 in, but they're not losing water. And so it's a mechanism to be able to control breathing with water loss. So they can try and create that balance there. Now, we went through a lot of adaptations right there. Not all plants have all those adaptations. Non-vascular plants don't have vascular tissue. That's part of the name, bryophytes. Liverworts, hornworts, mosses, they don't have those vascular tissues. They also sometimes, depending on which plant you're talking about, don't have a cuticle. They're living in really moist environments. They're not usually too worried about desiccation. And if it does dry up, they die. Then we have vascular plants, right? So ones that do have vascular tissue. And those are separated into seedless plants and the seed plants. The seedless plants, like lycophytes and spiritophytes, don't have any flowers or anything like that. And the seed plants, they do have, the angiosperms have flowers and the gymnosperms don't. Now these ones also typically, a lot of species will have wood, so because they form these really big trees. Sometimes they don't have wood and they're more herbaceous. So depending on which type you're talking about, they have different types of traits. So they don't all have all of them. So just to recap, land poses a lot of different challenges. You have to worry about desiccation. You have to figure out how to disperse your spores since you're out of the water now. You have to fight against gravity. So to do that, they have a lot of adaptations just to try and survive in those conditions. And depending on which taxa you're talking about, they have different adaptations to those. And depending on how reliant they are on wetlands or water bodies, they're going to have more or less of those adaptations. If you're living right on the edge of a really wet forested area, you don't have to worry about water loss that much. If you're living in the desert or up in the mountains where it's not going to rain too much during parts of the year, you have to greatly worry about desiccation. And so, as we talk more about plant taxonomy and plant anatomy and physiology later on, you're going to learn more about the specifics of each type of plant throughout the course.